So, okay, let's go to verses 5 through 9. Next relationship, slaves and masters. It says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Now, in the New Testament world, okay, Paul is addressing this letter to the church in Ephesus. What kinds of issues do you think there might be in the early church with slaves and masters? Well, there were many slaves in the Roman world. About 1/3 of the population of the city of Rome were slaves. And there were different types of slaves. And since Paul is writing this letter to an urban center, he's probably has in mind primarily household slaves. Slave owners could do whatever they wanted with their slaves, but it wasn't uncommon for slave owners and slaves to have affection for each other, to really have spent so much time with each other that they cared about each other and took care of each other. And so slave owners would sometimes they might pay them a little stipend, or they might allow their slave to work part-time for somebody else or rent them out to somebody else, and they would be able to keep part of that money so they could maybe buy their freedom at some point. So it was not, as John had said, it was not as we often think of slavery. But the slave owners owned their slave. It was property, and they could do whatever they wanted with their slave. All right? It's just that there were some instances where there was some affection and where there was some good relationships between them. Now, Paul addresses slaves and masters here from the perspective that they're both believers. He says slaves are to obey their earthly masters as they would obey Christ. They were to work hard even when their master wasn't around, because this is the will of God. And masters were to treat their slaves as if the Lord were watching them at all times. Masters could use threats to get their slaves to do what they wanted done. Threats of beatings, threats of being sold, threats of being given undesirable tasks, even threats of death. Yet Paul says here that's not what a Christian slave should do, or a slave master should do. A Christian master should never do this, because someday the slave master will stand before the judgment of God. And he says here, God isn't going to prefer Roman citizens over non-citizens. And God isn't going to prefer Jews to Greeks, and he's not going to prefer slave owners to slaves. He says there is no favoritism with God. So he talks about this relationship and how it was to be unique because they knew Jesus.